This is my historical perspectives and current practices for special education. So starting in 1817, the American School for the Deaf opened. This was founded in Hartford, Connecticut, and was the first school for disabled children anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And then in 1832, the Perkins Institution for the Blind opened. In 1840, Rhode Island passed a law mandating compulsory education for all children. This was required by law for them to receive and for governments to provide. The Columbia Institution opened in 1864 that granted college degrees by the U.S. Congress for the deaf and the blind. It was the first college in the world to be established for people with disabilities. In 1870, the School for the Deaf and Blind offered comprehensive and educational programs for hearing and visually impaired students. In 1896, we got Plessy versus Ferguson. That was not directly related to education, but it set the precedent for separate but equal. And then in 1919, we got the Beatty versus Board of Education, in where special education or special needs students were expelled for physical abnormalities or drooling, because other students and teachers said that it made them uncomfortable. In 1922, we got the Council for Exceptional Children, which was the first advocacy group for children with disabilities. The Bradley Home opened in 1931, which was the first psychiatric hospital for children in the United States, established in Rhode Island. And then we got the Council for Retarded Citizens in 1933, which consisted of 5 mothers who protested against their children's exclusion from public schools. It led to the establishment of a special class for the children, even though the parents were the ones that sponsored it. In 1943, we got the classification of autism. And then in 1950, we got the National Association for Retarded Citizens. It was formed by 23 individual advocacy groups that had the same beliefs, so they decided to come together as one. And then we got Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which was the landmark court case that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, saying that separate is not equal. While this was specifically brought to attention for Black versus white, it did also deal with special needs students versus general education students. And then in 1965, we got the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which didn't make it a law to educate students with disabilities, but it gave grants to schools that put into place programs to educate those students. We got the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1971. This sided in favor of students with intellectual and learning disabilities in state-run institutions. And then also in 1971, we got the In the Mills versus Board of Education of the District of Columbia, which helps classify students as exceptional. That included those with mental and learning disabilities and behavioral issues. In 1972, the first Center for Independent Living opened. And then in 1973, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act allowed protection from discrimination of special needs and disabilities. In 1975, Education for All Handicapped Children Act passed, and this literally just made sure that students with disabilities were educated in public schools. We got the Least Restrictive Environment Act also in 1975, or LRE. That means that with a student's IEP, they must be included in regular education classes as much as possible. We got the Board of Education of HHCD versus Raleigh in 1982. This was a 2-part test to determine whether FAPE was being met according to the student's IEP or not in different states. The Handicapped Children's Protection Act was signed in 1986, and it gave parents of children with disabilities more say in the development of their child's IEP or individual education plan. In 1990, we got the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was signed into law by President George W. Bush, and it promised people that had special needs the same rights that were given to everyone else. IDEA was established in 1990. That included 6 pillars of FAPE, LRE, IEP, evaluation, parent and student participation, and all procedural safeguards for participants. We got the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002 that states that all students should be proficient in math and reading. And then IDEA was reauthorized in 2004 that had changes including the IEP due process and student discipline. So today, children with disabilities are mainly in general education classrooms. This is really important and involves inclusion, which helps to make all students feel comfortable and important. They do have specific transportation for students, like on the buses or something. And then if you do have a physical disability, then they make special exceptions, like for physical education classes. Oh no, okay, sorry about that. And then they also have specific teachers that will come into the classroom to assist or even work one-on-one with students for a little bit every day, just to make sure that all students are succeeding. In the future, I predict that we will see these trends continue to improve, keeping inclusion specifically to a high. I predict more effective means to help teach and assist those with disabilities, and more specifically, teachers who are specifically trained and know how to work with that and the best way to go about helping disabled students. And then these are just the sources that I used for my timeline, the SPED textbook, and then the History of Special Education website that I found.